It's only Monday, or Tuesday, I guess. I'm confused. But my name is Sean Faulkner. This is Manny Silva. And this is scaling marketing in docs with privacy-safe RAG model. So does anybody here work in a function where you're, write technical documentation, maybe you write blog posts, maybe on the engineering side, you have to do root cause analysis, any kind of thing like that? A few people, there you go, yeah. So even if you're an engineer, there's lots of times when you're creating content on behalf of something like an outage or whatever it is. And essentially, we're going to be talking about scaling for this type of problem. Now, our big challenge at our company Skyflow is how do we scale content creation? So Manny's team's in charge of documentation, small team. We always need technical documentation to be up to date with new product releases, new features, all these types of things so that customers actually know how to use the product. And then my team is in charge of generating a variety of different content from press releases, social media, blog posts, both technical and non-technical content. And it becomes a really big challenge to essentially sort of keep up. And each time we launch a new product feature, we're going to have documentation that goes along with that. We're going to have potentially a blog post that talks about it at maybe a different level than you would talk about it in documentation. And then, of course, press release is going to be at an even different level. But you want essentially consistency across all these things. Oh, we just lost the, oh, there we go. And then all this stuff needs a certain amount of promotion. So we're generating content on social media, maybe ads, webinars. So we need to essentially keep this content machine running. This machine doesn't stop, essentially. And we have small teams, so how do we keep up? And then also, how do we maintain quality and consistency as essentially the demands on our teams continue to scale? And additionally, we want to look at how do we scale beyond ourselves? How do we empower different people within Skyflow, regardless of where you sit in the organization, to contribute to content, at least in the first draft standpoint. But how can we do that in a way where they're able to hit essentially the sort of standards that we set for ourselves and set for our teams? Now, additionally, besides these challenges, like many organizations, we have a big unstructured data challenge where the types of reference content or the answers to questions that people might have exist in a variety of different locations. Like it's going to exist in Drive, email, Confluence, all these different places. And as organizations scale, you get even more of these sort of data silos. And there's not a morning that goes by where I don't wake up and I look at my Slack messages and overnight there's been a question in Slack where the answer exists in one of these places, yet the person who posed that question either couldn't find it or maybe they didn't even try to look in those places. But that creates even more data silos and more thrashing and problems where the answer to these questions maybe starts to exist in something like Slack, which is not really that reproducible and useful for the larger organization. Now, luckily, there has been a tremendous amount of innovation in the world of managing unstructured data over the last couple of years. So we were very interested in seeing how could we essentially leverage LLM technology to help us solve some of these problems and essentially scale our content and our marketing and documentation needs, as well as other parts of the company. And of course, we looked at things like ChatGPT. I use ChatGPT probably almost every day. It's a great tool, but it's also a very general tool. So in trying to use it for something like this, the tone's going to be off. It's going to miss context. It doesn't know as much about Skyflow and the things that we need to produce as we do, essentially, because it doesn't have access to our files. So it's only going to have what's available in the public, and it's going to be fixed at some sort of epoch as well. So there's limitations to what we can do there. And it's not going to be able to match, essentially, our brand expectations. And as a privacy and security company, we also maybe are not that comfortable necessarily sharing a bunch of internal information, even if we were able to stuff that into the context window of ChatGPT. We might not be comfortable doing that. So that led us to essentially asking this question and kicking off this project internally of what if we built our own content copilot? There we could essentially customize it. It would know about Skyflow, it would have access to our files, it would speak our language. The content format we could also control, where the content format for a blog post or a press release or something like RCA, documentation, different types of documentation is going to be substantially different. Essentially, and then the last thing, and potentially most importantly for us, is if we use our own technology, and we'll talk a little bit about this Skyflow's LLM privacy gateway, we can essentially keep the data really secure and private, also taking advantage of a variety of other things that exist, both in open source world and platforms like Databricks. So how do we do privacy and security right in the world of LLMs? And this is a big challenge and a big topic of conversation right now, because we live in an increasingly regulated world. There's over 100 privacy regulations around the world. And even when we talk about essentially the world of structured data, where we have rows and columns and we kind of pinpoint the data, this is a really, really hard thing to navigate, because certain regulations essentially tell us that our data about our customers need to live within specific regions of the world, and there's different nuance about what we can transfer in and out. And it becomes really, really difficult to solve this problem. And when we get into the world of LLMs, there's essentially no rows, no columns, no delete button. So it's even more complicated. It's like you're taking a bunch of vegetables and a variety of other things that you're going to mix into a soup, and you're sort of churning that all into this like broth. And then once it's in the broth of the LLM, it's very hard to distinguish the carrots from essentially the celery. And we can't control who has access to just the carrots and then just the celery once it's in the broth. So this becomes really, really hard. And so we have to be careful essentially with what we use to train LLMs, regardless of how we're feeding that information in, because once it's in there, there's not really a way to essentially delete it or get it back, at least not in a reasonable way. And in the world of GDPR and things like the right to be forgotten, that becomes a big, big problem, because you can't essentially remove it. And ultimately, we want to be able to control who sees what, when, and where. Just like in essentially the world of structured data. Your customer support team has different needs than your marketing team or the person who owns the data. So in the world of LLMs, when I ask a question like, I want to see Cindy Johnson's customer information, depending on who I am and who's putting in that prompt, I should be able to see essentially a different response. So if I'm Bob from customer support, I get one response. And if I'm Cindy who owns that data, I should have a different response. And if I'm Dave, some random guy in the company that has access to it, I probably shouldn't be able to see the information at all. And there's a lot of talk around things like private LLM, and I think private LLM's great, but you're basically putting a security perimeter around your LLM. It doesn't help you solve this problem about how do you gate the access once you've given access to the actual LLM product or application. And this is really what privacy is about, is controlling access in a way that makes sense to our customer or user. Now, this is an area that we've been working on at Skyflow over the last year and a half. And essentially, we launched a product that we call Skyflow LLM Privacy Gateway. And what this does is it allows you to essentially keep PII and other sensitive data like intellectual property out of the model, but still give you essentially a version of that data such that you can still train the model and get the value out of the actual model. So during data collection or data processing, you can essentially detect and de-identify data from both structured and unstructured data. And we'll go into detail about how some of this stuff works. And then essentially you're training against a clean version of that data. So we're replacing the sensitive data with non-sensitive representations. And essentially, the training can carry on. The LLM doesn't care that my name is there as long as there's essentially a consistently represented version of my name there. And then when it comes time to inference, a similar process can happen where when we put in a prompt, the prompt could, of course, contain sensitive data, so we want to be able to detect it and secure it and de-identify it and give essentially that clean prompt onto the LLM to generate a response. And then when we're generate the response, we can pass that back through the vault to essentially rehydrate any de-identified values, applying policies that you create to control access so that we can essentially control who sees what, when, where, and even for how long. All right, so we're going to get into essentially talking a little bit about our specific solution. So our content copilot is called VerbaGBT. That's essentially what we built. And the goal with VerbaGBT, as I talked about, was we want anyone within Skyflow to be able to use this product to generate content. At least a first draft. That's really the goal. Like, you still need to look at this stuff. We can't fully trust it and just put it out on the internet. We also wanted to have privacy and security controls in place so that we're not oversharing sensitive information into the LLM, even when we're doing something like RAG. and have fine-grained access control on that. And the goal here, for example, is that there's certain information, like products that haven't been launched yet, where it makes sense for Manny and his team to have access to that information so that they can produce documentation that goes along with that product feature, but we might not want the sales team to necessarily have access to something that hasn't been launched yet, because they might get confused and start selling something that doesn't exist yet. Or there's certain proprietary information, like something that we have a patent on, polymorphic data encryption, where there's internal information that is important to the engineering team that talks about that product feature. We don't necessarily want someone from sales directly having access to and accidentally sharing with the customer. So in terms of the tech stack, pretty simple stuff. We'll go into detail on some of this, but essentially the front end is Streamlit. We use Fast API for the API layer. The LLM stack, we're using Claude from Anthropic, Hugging Face, LangChain, kind of standard tools that you would use for RAG model, and the LLM Privacy Gateway from Skyflow. The actual model that is used, we've made this sort of plug and play, so we've played with different models, but it's very flexible. You could essentially deploy the same approach with running private LLM, public LLM. You could sort of pick and choose the model of your choice. Now, I'll stop down on what is RAG. I'm sure tons of people already are familiar with this, but just in case you wandered in here and you're not familiar with this, the idea is when we're essentially prompting an LLM, can we use search to bring in additional information to help augment the knowledge that the LLM has access to? This allows us to essentially give additional information the LLM hasn't been trained on, explicitly give more up-to-date information and make it more context sensitive. So in this case, I can say write a press release about Skyflow's latest fundraise. I can go and find the relevant context for that in essentially a vector database or some other information retrieval approach, attach that to the prompt, and then essentially run that inference cycle and get something that's more meaningful. So this is what we're using for essentially VerbaGPT. And that starts out by essentially creating what we call a privacy-safe embedding model. So we're going to take all our data sources. This is a combination of both internal and external documents. So things like documentation blogs, PRDs, engineering design docs, and so forth, contracts. And some of these contain sensitive data. So this is a contract from an event that we sponsored back in March. And there's relevant information for VerbaGPT to know about here. Like it's useful for VerbaGPT to know that we're going to be at this event so we can produce maybe like a social media post that's relevant. But it doesn't necessarily need access to like my name, my phone number, my email, or sometimes these contracts have business information, business IDs, maybe it even has bank account information and stuff like that. So we want to pull that stuff out. So we can use essentially the LLM Privacy Gateway to detect information like that within unstructured sources like this and replace it with what we call context-aware tokens. So we're replacing each one, maintaining what the entity is, like name, email, phone number, location, all this type of stuff, but replacing the actual value with a de-identified value. And then from there, we now have a clean set of data to essentially build the RAG model against. And this would work for fine-tuning or even if you're building like a foundation model from scratch. And then we can use whatever tools you want that you would conventionally use for a pipeline like this. We're using Python LangChain, chunking, essentially chunking the data using sentence transformer, creating the embedding model from that, storing it in a vector database. So now our vector database has a representation of this data, but it's free of essentially anything sensitive. And then during inference, when we put in a prompt, we're going to pass that prompt through the privacy gateway again, and we're going to detect and de-identify anything sensitive in it and create a clean representation of the prompt to then search the vector database. From there, we'll get the relevant chunks that we want to use to essentially augment the context. And on top of that, we combine that if we're drafting content, and we'll get into the details of how this works. We combine that with a prompt template that essentially helps us structure the response in a way that's meaningful based on the type of content we want to produce, whether it's a blog post, a piece of documentation or something like that. And then we run that through the LLM and essentially produce a response, pass that through the gateway again to re-identify or rehydrate the response if necessary to create a contextual response. So we've had some slide technical issues, so now for a live demo where nothing ever goes wrong. All right, so we're going to take a look at a couple of different things here. Let's start with VerbaGPT. So this is VerbaGPT. Oh, let's go to ChatGPT, and we'll start a new chat. So I can do like ChatGPT. I'll say, what is Skyflow, just as a comparison. Oh, all right, there we go. So this is actually not bad. I mean, this is pretty simple. You can find this information online. Data privacy company provides an API-based data privacy model. Yeah, that's accurate. All right, and then VerbaGPT, if I do the same thing, I already did this, essentially, it's a little bit more detailed, but one of the other things you get here that essentially is these references, because of course, ChatGPT is not gonna have that information. Now, the true power, it's one thing to chat with it. The true power is really around drafting, as Manny was talking about. Because the point here is not to necessarily have a conversation with it, but to actually generate content. And there, the requirements in terms of speed is completely different, just like if you're talking about like autonomous agents. Like if I had, if wanted to use an autonomous agent to say, go figure out like my next family vacation or something like that, if it comes back 24 hours from now, that's totally fine. I don't need a real-time response. So here, essentially, I can switch to draft mode and I can say something like docs how to, and these are all the sort of templates that we support. And I can say, write documentation explaining how to integrate, say, Skyflow with Databricks, include relevant code examples. All right, so that'll go off, and then we'll, just for while that is doing its thing, we'll also put the same thing in ChatGPT just for fun. So, of course, ChatGPT is gonna generate something, and it's very fast, it's great. And it's even generating some code samples. And if you didn't know anything about how any of this worked, whether Skyflow or Databricks, this looks pretty good. Like, it looks reasonable. The problem, of course, is that it's all made up. So it would actually probably take Manny and his team more work to undo the damage that this just did than to just write it from scratch.
It does, I've been there.
Yeah, so that's a problem. Now, on the flip side, here we're getting essentially something that's much, much closer to sort of final product, or at least like a reasonable first draft, where one is following the sort of templates that we use to produce documentation. So it's gonna match our style that we would put together for a how-to guide. And then it's also actually, the code examples are actually much, much closer to being something that we reasonably include because it knows about our SDKs, our APIs, and so forth, and has access to essentially understanding how Skyflow works. And then it can also intelligently link to additional content that is relevant. Now, another thing that we can do here is let's go and generate, let's say, a press release. And then this is one of the things that Manny was talking about, where essentially we've already have the RAG model, but if I have something additional, maybe it's new or something really specific, that's project specific, I can include web page or an upload file. I'll include a PRD here, which is about bin lookup, which is essentially how do you convert the bin number of a credit card into who the credit card creator is, and essentially. There we can augment this further with essentially like customized information. So I can say something like, write a press release announcing Skyflow's support for bin lookup. And then that's gonna take a few minutes. So, but like a good cooking show, I already did it, which has disappeared. So we'll go back here. So while that is churning away, it's going to take probably 30 seconds or something like that. We'll take a look at, this is the advantage of having multiple demos, is we'll take a look at how some of the stuff that we're talking around the privacy gateway works. So one of the things with the privacy gateway is you have a bunch of essentially unstructured data that you're probably feeding into an LLM where you're trading like a RAG model, or even if you're doing something where you're just trying to populate like a data lake or something. So a big part of that is how do you essentially detect and de-identify that data. And we have essentially an API endpoint, we call it the detect service. We do this in sort of batch mode. And I have a simple example here where I have a bunch of text that talks about me being Steve Jobs. And I can have essentially, as part of the API, allow and deny lists. So if there's things that are very specific to my company, like that are protected, like maybe a product name or something like that, or if you look at companies that are pharmaceutical companies, they have very, very specific needs around drug names and stuff like that they don't want to, necessarily share with everybody. And then there's essentially entity types that also we will that are already pre-baked into our machine learning algorithms to be able to pick up. And you're in control essentially of what type of information you want to automatically detect. So when I run this, essentially, it's going to take that information and it can identify these various information, and in the response, you can see here it's actually replaced those values with this. Does this work? There we go. This context-aware token. So it's essentially the entity, in this case, name, and we're using a particular token type where we're just using a numeric value on it. And it's giving you in the response as well, like what the original value was, what the process value, and the location within the text. So this is essentially how we do both the de-identification, and then we can rehydrate it on the response. And I'll do one last one here. This is a lease agreement. We could do something like this, where there could be certainly circumstances where you might want to take a lease agreement, throw it at an LLM, and say summarize this or let me know what I need to know about this kind of thing. And essentially, we can detect. Here's all essentially the response where we've removed the sensitive data, but now we can essentially still use that in sort of a privacy safe way. All right, let's go back to VerbaGPT and look at our press release here. So now, essentially, we can create, we don't need to go into detail here, but a press release that is much more sort of context aware of what we're actually launching than we would be able to do otherwise. And of course, we're going to edit this and everything, but we were much, much closer to being able to move forward with getting everybody ready to push this out to the press than we would be if we had to essentially create all this stuff from scratch. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Great questions.